Good afternoon, good morning. I'm very delighted to have a special guest, Megan Bastick, to our virtual studio today. Today is first day of spring, and I hope that this spring will bring us more hope and strength in these very challenging times. Thank you very much, Megan, for accepting this interview, this conversation with us. As you know, Civil Council on Defense and Security is regularly organizing such interviews with professionals, experts on various subjects of security sector reform, democratization, diversity, inclusion, gender equality issues, equal opportunity issues, focusing on defense and security sector. As we see, this sector is the backbone for other and for the development and democratization of the whole country. So this is the concept we stand on. And thank you very much. I'm delighted to present you to our audience. Megan is Gender Security Fellow with Geneva Center for Security Policy Governance, and she's working with Geneva Center since 2005 on various issues on violence against women, sexual violence in armed forces, gender and security sector reform, and traveled and worked in different countries of the world, having experience working with international organizations like UN, OSCE, NATO, different governments, and that's extraordinary experience. And Megan is also Megan has experience in working in Georgia, and I think we will have time to speak about that experience and Georgia's achievements in this regard. Once again, I'm very delighted to have this conversation today. And maybe you can, and what I want and what we want to discuss today is actually somehow to review past 20 years of adoption of UN Security Council Resolution 1325, major shifts related to the policy, theory, practice, achievements, new challenges, and how you, as very experienced person, being in the field from the beginning, how you can characterize where the world stands now. So, Megan, what are the major shifts related to gender and security policy in theory, practice, and how you can characterize these developments since the adoption of the resolution? Yes, please.
Sharena, it's such a pleasure to be having this conversation. Thank you very much for inviting me to join you. I've been working in Georgia at various times in different ways for the last 9 years now, eight years, and I found that work really interesting. So it's really nice to have a chance to sort of reflect more broadly with your community of people that you work with. So major shifts in relation to gender and security and women, peace and security. I really see, looking back, I guess two that really stand out for me. First, the way the women, peace and security agenda has expanded. And secondly, this process of institutionalization of the agenda. So I think when we look back to the adoption of Security Council Resolution 1325, the initial wave of activism and work was very much around adding women into international security processes and adding women into security sector institutions. So a lot of the early work focused on women in peacekeeping, with, of course, explicit references to women being deployed in peacekeeping in the resolutions, and a focus on women in peace negotiations. And whilst those elements are still there in the resolutions and still important, I think we then saw a move much more toward gender analysis. So Resolution 1325 didn't focus on gender mainstreaming and gender analysis, but later resolutions brought that language in. And I think that has been part of a broader recognition that you can't just add women into institutions without thinking more holistically about how institutions and processes are gendered. And I think, for example, we see this very much in work with the armed forces and other security sector institutions. Initiatives to recruit women in and of themselves are rarely successful and sustainable. You need to look at the gender culture of the whole institution. So I think that has been a really important development, and it's helped the women, peace and security agenda articulate its linkages to the Beijing platform, to the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. And, work has been done within CEDAW to really map what the meaning of the resolution is in legal terms. I mean, there was a lot of early debate, is 1325 binding international law? And I think we understand much more now that it reflects and articulates the obligations that are already there in international human rights law to a large extent. So I think that shift to a more gendered approach is really important. And then I think what we really see now is almost the women, peace and security agenda being a way of seeing the whole world. And we see the connections made between women, peace and security and issues like refugees and migration, the arms trade, sustainable development, climate change, of course, COVID. We see that the issues around women's inclusion, challenging militarism, thinking about how structures of peace and security exclude particular people with an intersectional lens. Now those connections are really being made across all policy areas. And so it's much bigger and much more than the initial focus really on women and peacekeeping.
Yeah.
And then I guess the second major trend I mentioned was institutionalization. And I think that's been a really positive development, that what began as a demand for change, articulated primarily by civil society, women's civil society in the peace community, is now something that government ministries, regional organisations like the OSCE, NATO, of course the EU, the AU, all the major regional organisations almost now have an approach to women, peace and security. And we see women, peace and security really being almost used as an indicator of a nation's liberal values or their democratic aspirations, that countries that want to be seen as progressive are forward-leaning women, peace and security. And I think the ultimate expression of that is now this new emergence of feminist foreign policy, where some countries are saying not only is this part of our foreign policy and development policy, this is really a guiding value for our whole government. So I think that's a very exciting,
absolutely, very impressive. Yeah, I think for this last 20 years, 2 decades, a lot of things happened. And first of all, analysis, institutionalization on this on state policy level. But on the other hand, we see also a lot of changes in perceptions, attitudes, representation of women in movies, and especially in these military political aspects of them. Because before that, I mean, in like 3 decades ago, it was not like that. I mean, this representation is very different, and it gives hope that this equality and equity we are speaking about that could be implemented and achievable in future. And from what you said, I think what DCAF is doing is extraordinary to promote, support, strengthen this 1325 agenda with its expanded priorities and directions. And it would be interesting to hear from you what DCAF is doing and what is its distinct approaches regarding mainstreaming gender equality in defense and security sector.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yeah, happy to talk about that. As you say, I've been with DCAF since 2005, which is perhaps an unusually long time to stay in the same organisation nowadays. So I've really seen how work around this area has shifted in that time. For us in DCAF, we initially began to work on violence against women, on sexual violence in armed conflict, on human trafficking. And I think for us, our different perspective was that DCAF title is, the name of the organisation is now the Geneva Centre for Security Sector Governance, but originally it was the Centre for Democratic Control of Armed Forces. We were an organisation very focused on working with the security sector. So initially it was quite unusual for an organisation focused on the security sector to have a strong program of work on women's rights. So I think where a lot of work was being done within women's organisations around, of course, around violence against women and 1325, there weren't so many security-orientated organisations that began to work on this issue so early. And so that has meant that we've always had an ease of working with perhaps ministries of interior, ministries of defence, even border and intelligence services. That is unusual in having the ability, the trusted relationships with those sorts of organisations where you can open space to talk about gender equality, and organisations that are often perhaps don't so easily traditionally work with women's civil society organisations, for example. So it's led us to develop this program of work, which we now have really on every continent. Initially, we worked primarily in the Western Balkans, in West and Southern Africa, around women, peace and security. But now DCAF is really doing this work also in the MENA region, in the Sahel, of course, in Georgia and Ukraine, also in Latin America. So often our work is with security sector institutions themselves, and working very much as a sort of partner and critical friend to help them work through strengthening their institutional structures and mechanisms, and where possible, opening space for partnership and dialogue with civil society organisations, but perhaps working more on the inside than the traditional NGO sector does.
Yeah.
And I guess the approach that we try and be guided by is the aspiration of transformational change. So again, recognising that there's been a lot of initiatives around gender training for the security sector, around sessions on women, peace and security, but you need to change the whole institution to create deep, meaningful, sustained change. And so that means challenging institutions to look at their institutional culture more broadly than just how they treat women.
Yeah, absolutely. On the one hand, gender equality, let's say, it's the vision and it's what we're aspiring to. But on the other hand, it seems it's a very good tool to make changes into institutions. So, and that aspect is also very important, and it's very much linked to DCAF's work and how you approach the work. So, because we see that with these breaking rules, speaking about stereotypes, that helps very much to some even institutional changes, because institutions are about people and their approaches, attitudes, stereotypes, how they are involved in. So for me, it's on the other hand, it's very, very strong tool to make changes in the institutions. And to add to this, I was absolutely impressed with the small documentaries you have created on gender and security. And actually, they worked very well as the training tool and learning tool. We have used it in Georgia, and I mean, it would be very interesting to tell us about creating this film, because there was everything. I sometimes it's difficult to explain people how these gender needs, why they are different. Yeah, because when everybody is suffering, in troublesome societies or communities, and that was very good. Expression of and very explicit one, what we wanted to them to understand what we are talking about. Please tell us more about these films, the creation, the topics and issues you have unpacked very well in this small great attempts. Please tell us about them.
Very happy to. That is so nice to hear that you're using them and they're useful. Thank you so much for saying, because of course, many our organizations all produce resources, and you don't always get a lot of feedback as to how they're used. So this was really, to be entirely honest, a COVID adaptation. At the beginning of last year, just as we all went into lockdown, DCAF with OSCE, ODIHR and UN Women launched the Gender and Security Toolkit. I encourage all your viewers to go and look at it. It's all available in Georgian. And this was an update, really, of a resource that was published initially in 2007, 2008, the Gender and SSR Toolkit. So we developed a range of resources to support work to promote gender equality and integrate a gender perspective in the security sector. And it's a selection of publications. And we initially were planning to come to Georgia at the beginning of March to do a launch event and to have a workshop with people from across the Georgian institutions and across the region, and actually to do similar sorts of traditional workshops in a range of countries and regions. But then we couldn't travel. So we said, well, what will we do with that money we have earmarked to promote the toolkit? And we thought about developing some films. And we worked with a really fantastic Scottish digital developer called Media Co-op that works exclusively with charities and with the public sector. So we found some filmmakers who are committed feminists, have lots of experience doing work on films around women's rights, violence against women, bias. That made a huge difference because you were working with these incredibly talented, creative people who totally understood what you were talking about when you said you wanted to do a film about institutional gender bias. They're like, yes, we understand. So what we did is we created a sort of suite of films, one of which is focused on why is gender important in security and justice, and really through a storytelling technique illustrates the way in which if you overlook gendered security needs, this will negatively impact your capacity to provide people with security and justice. And the second film is more focused on the idea of gender bias and what that means to think of an institution as being gender biased. And really the methodology for developing these films was a very sort of detailed thinking through who is your target audience? And I think often we don't do this enough when we think about sitting down to write something. So we thought, for example, of somebody sitting in a Ministry of Interior who was responsible for gender mainstreaming, but hadn't really had been thinking about women, but hadn't really thought about institutional gender bias. And so when we developed a film around gender bias, we always had this individual in mind. And similarly, when we had developed the films around why does gender matter, we were thinking of a parliamentarian actually as one of our key, typical audience members. So somebody who has responsibilities for thinking about gender mainstreaming in the security sector, and is sort of broadly committed to the idea, but doesn't really understand what it means to think about gender in a holistic way. So it was for us a really interesting new way of working, to work on digital resources and to do it in a way where you really thought, you're not the target audience, Sharina, I'm not the target audience. The target audience is an entirely different sort of person. And actually it's led to this range of films that are really fun and engaging to watch, and we're finding really appeal to people in different parts of the world coming from the very different institutions. So, we really encourage people to use them. We're happy to make them available for further translation, and we really have put them out there as tools that we hope other people really widely use as well. So delighted
Megan,
that you...
we also put a link on our website. Is it? Can we? Yes. Actually, in our project, I think we have shared some of the posters with you. When we were writing or developing this idea about diversity inclusion in security sector institutions in Georgia, we were thinking that we need some kind of illustration of what we are meaning in that. So, and we also used to work with artists here, and we have developed together like 19 posters on illustrating police and diversity, inclusion, gender in armed forces. And that was very creative process. And we also lucky that this artist was also very open, very feminist, very tolerant. I mean, and that was very interesting process of working. So, and we will share some additional posters we have with you. That's fantastic. Yes.
I think it's a recognition, isn't it, that when you're working on gender equality, you want to change the way people feel about the world. Not just saying, well, read my very interesting, well-researched policy brief. You want to touch people's sort of deepest assumptions about the world, challenge them to see the world through a gendered lens. And so to do that, you have to think about engaging in a sort of more immediate, emotional, perhaps, sense.
Yes, and actually we have used these posters during the training. We gave it to the groups and asked them to name, to think about the stories behind. And that was an amazing experience because we had a new metaphors for equality, for diversity among our training groups, and that's amazing. I think these crossovers, I mean, arts, some everything. It helps very much to internalize the problem and think in different ways. And from that perspective, I mean, how has DCAF supported work on gender mainstreaming in defense and security sector in Georgia? And what do you think as like opportunities, milestones in that work? So that's also important just to you're as a professional working in Georgia, but at the same time outsider. So how you perceive what's going on here, where we are now. So please.
Yeah, I guess DCAF's work around gender in a way in Georgia came from two directions. So initially for us who worked in DCAF's gender team, in 2012, we were approached by UN Women in Georgia to work with them on a training manual for women's organisations in Georgia and the women's networks that were interested in working on women, peace and security. So we worked with UN Women around developing this training manual and facilitating some dialogue with civil society groups through a series of workshops. But then in parallel to that, there were other colleagues within DCAF who for years had been working with the Parliamentary Security Committee and with different parts of the security sector. And the demand came from that direction, initially from the Parliamentary Security Committee, to learn more about the rights of women in armed forces. So the first time I came to Georgia myself was in 2013, where the OSCE and DCAF co-organised an event in the Parliament around women in armed forces. And I think that sort of entry point still remains significant because in Georgia, I think one of the interesting things around the engagement you have with women, peace and security is that the armed forces and Ministry of Defence has been, really comparatively very proactive on this. So initially, there was this work that was centred on engaging with parliamentarians. And then DCAF was also working to support the Public Defender's Office on their capacity to oversee the work of the security sector. And some of that work focused on gender mainstreaming. So as I'm sure your audience knows, your Public Defender's Office has a really strong focus on gender equality. Yeah. And we worked with the staff of the office and the Public Defender to think about, well, what does that mean in relation to the security and justice sector, and what are some of the approaches that you can use to strengthen how you, for example, oversee work around the integration of women and addressing sexual harassment and gender-related rights in security and justice. And those areas of work sort of created an opportunity, I guess, for us to meet people, meet initially the Deputy Minister, then working around women's integration and 1325 within the defence structures, and really develop a very collaborative relationship with staff within the Ministry of Defence who work on gender equality and monitor gender equality. So some of that work has been supporting gender advisors within the Ministry of Defence. Some has been focused on gender-related complaints like sexual harassment and discrimination, strengthening the capacity of the defence structures to deal with those. And then over the last few years, we worked with the Ministry of Defence on supporting them to develop what's called an institutional climate assessment, so a gender-responsive survey and focus group structure to understand the experience of personnel. Now, currently, we're working with them on helping them shape a sort of women's career development program. So it's been, I think, a really interesting relationship because we've worked on a lot of intersecting issues, but very much, sustaining that engagement over many years. So you asked about, I guess, what I see as opportunities, and I think there are many in Georgia. In many ways, it's a very sort of fruitful atmosphere to work on gender equality issues. I think at various points, the work we've been doing with the armed forces, for example, has been enabled by a broader public debate about, at various points, domestic violence and, the killing of women in domestic contexts, then by sexual harassment discussions. So there was always a sense that we were doing work within the armed forces and defence, but these were issues that the wider Georgian society was talking about, was concerned about. And what I see as some of the possible opportunities now, I think it's a really great time to look at building structures for sharing lessons between institutions. So, for example, Ministry of Defence has for a long time had a strategy on gender equality. Not all the institutions have that, and there would be opportunities to more clearly create structures for sharing and learning. And I think similarly there can be really fruitful learning across the region. So Georgia has many things it could share with its partners. Certainly there's a lot of work going on around gender equality in Ukraine and Moldova. I think some of these dialogues are already happening in more ad hoc ways, but I think there are models where you could not only have dialogue, at a political level around gender equality, you could try and build connections between people working in different ministries of defence or ministries of interior or intelligence services even, for example, people who are doing day-to-day work on gender equality, to try and create platforms for them to share and learn from each other. I think certainly within other regional contexts, that's been quite powerful to help keep the work going and to really, in a very concrete day-to-day way, support each other and share lessons learned.
Yeah, very, very interesting. And somehow to sum up our discussion, so what do you see as the new issues or priorities emerging for defense and security sector globally? And how can taking a gender perspective will help us to address those challenges? And how we in Georgia can also somehow use that perspective for democratizing and sensitizing our institutions. So what do you think about this?
I think like many, I have this sense that COVID has really changed our worldview, everyone's worldview, but the view we have of what security is and what the security sector is for. And I think that raises some concerns. I think we have seen through COVID in many countries the deployment of militaries in new ways, and it's sometimes problematic when, you know, that we have there should be a meaningful distinction between civilian and military authorities and due care to how you use your militaries. But at the same time, COVID has really underscored the lessons that were already there from increasing humanitarian disasters and climate problems, that we need security sector institutions that can respond to the new things we recognise as human security challenges, so health pandemics, natural disasters, including, of course, in Georgia, you've had plenty of experience with flooding and the sort of difficulties that are becoming very much part of our daily life, many of which, of course, are related to climate change. And I think that's part of a sort of a broader policy shift where there's a demand for armed forces to think about human security and what that means for them, and to be better able to do things like responding to humanitarian disasters, protecting civilians from violence, responding to issues like sexual violence in conflict. All of this is quite a long way from the traditional model of a very infantry, combat-focused military. And I think, I guess I'm talking particularly about militaries, but we see similar demands on police to think about crime prevention in a much more forward-looking way, and to forge new roles that are perhaps much closer to communities and much more responsive to the needs of communities. Now, I think in doing all of this, what we know is that thinking about the different needs of men and women, boys and girls, thinking about those needs in a way that's responsive to their differing forms of discrimination and need, whether that's related to ethnicity or language or sexuality or race. This is what it means to be an effective security sector institution, to be able to take all these different factors into account such that you are able to meet the needs of communities, and equally to be taking those factors into account so you can recruit your personnel from across the communities and offer an inclusive, welcoming work environment that then allows you to be more respected and trusted at local levels. So I think when we think about the new view that we have of the world at this end of the COVID pandemic, it really reinforces the need to think about human security in a very concrete way, and to work through what that means for our security sector institutions, for it not just to be a sort of development agenda in an international forum, but for it to be something we think about on national levels as well. I see that happening, for example, here in Great Britain, where the armed forces now have what sort of looks like policy. They have policy and guidance around human security, and they are training and deploying human security advisors. And this is just quite new work, but I think a really interesting demonstration of an effort to think beyond the traditional notion of what the security sector is for. And I think as particularly the impacts of climate change and the security impacts of climate change become more and more clearly felt, that is something that the whole security sector will really need to grapple with in terms of what it means for their role.
Yeah. Thank you, Megan. The problem I see in countries like Georgia is that our governance is preoccupied with ongoing problems, and there is no space left for analysis, reflection, and planning. So I think the role of DCAF and international organizations is to support these countries providing these tools for analysis, because it would be very sad if after this experience we are having in this pandemic and nothing on policy level would change. So, I mean, we need that analysis. We need this and sensitizing also our politicians about that this is not an usual business. We have to react, be proactive in terms of be equipped with these analytical tools and implement them. So I think that maybe new agenda for DCAF, for these organizations would be helping and supporting these governments in realizing, reflecting, and analyzing the lessons they've learned from pandemic and the new mission, or I don't know, the new face of security sector itself, taking into consideration all the existing challenges, climate change, as you told, pandemic, and everything what's in our lives. So I think that would be very good help, because we realize that analysis, we lack that analysis, and we are still facing the problem that if everything goes well and we overcome pandemic, we have to reflect on the lessons learned to continue our path to democratization and building our democratic state. So that's very important. And thank you for this discussion, and thanks for reviewing this the whole patch of the history since the adoption of 1325. Yes, and how this agenda was enriched with new expanded and reached, how new challenges were not developed, but analyzed and responded. So I think that, yes, we are on our way to creating and developing our democracy. But on the other hand, we have to acknowledge that we are also part of the world, and we are as responsible for this world as any other countries. And that's also very important to place yourself in all these international relations and international challenges, and take some responsibility for them, for those challenges. And thank you very much for the work you are doing personally, what DCAF is doing and helping our country. And I hope that we will continue our cooperation and friendship. And thanks for your amazing work.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity to have this conversation, which I've really enjoyed. And as we were saying before we started recording, I'm just so grateful that my career has lent me the opportunity to come to Georgia, which I just think is a fantastic country. And I've really enjoyed the opportunity to develop friends and colleagues there. And it's such an interesting environment and such a beautiful and rich country. And so it is, a real privilege to be working with you and with colleagues in Georgia. I hope we can continue these conversations face to face before long again.
Thank you very much.